Hello, my name is Ken, and I've been a Civil War buff for many years. My original American Civil War quiz contained 20 questions, and this quiz contains all of those 20 questions, plus 5 more new questions, and I have added in many more comments and trivia in the answers to each one of those original 20 questions. So if you took my original 20 question Civil War quiz here on YouTube and you enjoyed it, then I think you'll really enjoy this new 25 question Civil War quiz, because not only have I tried to make this quiz educational, I've also tried to make it very entertaining. And I believe some folks will enjoy this quiz best if they don't try to do it all in just one setting, but rather do it in 15-minute intervals. Putting together an American Civil War quiz and double checking and triple checking all of the facts is not as easy as it looks, and I do it strictly for the love of doing it. And hopefully it will be educational, beneficial, and fun for many of you college professors, school teachers, history students, and all of you Civil War buffs out there. And now, with all of that said, let's get started. Each question is worth 4 points. Good luck, and here we go. Question 1. Where did the abolitionist John Brown raid a United States arsenal on October the 16th of 1859? Was it A, Washington, D.C., or was it B, Harper's Ferry, Virginia, or was it C, Charleston, South Carolina, or was it D, Savannah, Georgia? The answer is B, Harper's Ferry, Virginia. John Brown's raid was a total failure, and of the 21 men who were in his raiding party, 10 of them were killed, and that included 2 of John Brown's own sons. 6 of his men were captured, tried, and hanged, and the other 5 of his men managed to escape and get away and were never caught. John Brown himself was captured, and 2 months later, in December of 1859, John Brown was hanged for treason and for murder. And Abraham Lincoln once said that John Brown was a misguided fanatic. Most historians agree that John Brown did not start the Civil War, but he did play a small part in getting the Civil War started. A couple of years after John Brown's execution and during the Civil War, there was a popular song that came out that was often sung by Union soldiers that was called "Old John Brown's Body Lies a Moldering in the Grave." 4 years later, after John Brown's raid, Harper's Ferry, Virginia became Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, after that part of the state broke away from Virginia and became a state of its own, and West Virginia joined the Union in 1863. And then after that, many Confederates started referring to those folks as hillbilly Yankees. Question 2. Which state was the first state to leave the United States that put Southern states' secession in motion? Was it A, South Carolina? Was it B, Mississippi? Was it C, Florida? Or was it D, Alabama? The correct answer is A, South Carolina. South Carolina was the first state to leave the United States on December the 20th of 1860. And soon afterwards, South Carolina was followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, North Carolina, Virginia, and the last state to leave the Union was Tennessee. All total, there were 11 southern states that formed the Confederate States of America. And even though Missouri and Kentucky never did officially withdraw from the United States, they were both considered to be Confederate states by the Confederacy. First Missouri in November of 1861, and then Kentucky in December of 1861. And that's why there are 13 stars on the Confederate Naval Jack flag, what some people call the Stars and Bars. And the star that's in the very center of that Confederate flag supposedly represents the state of Kentucky. Question 3. Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States throughout the entire Civil War. But who was the Confederate President throughout the entire Civil War? Was it A, James Buchanan? Or was it B, Andrew Johnson? Or was it C, Jefferson Davis? Or was it D, Robert E. Lee? The answer is C, Jefferson Davis from Mississippi. Jefferson Davis swore in as the President of the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederacy's first capital, on February the 18th, 1861. But 3 months later, on May the 20th, the Confederacy decided to move their capital to Richmond, Virginia, where the Confederate capital and the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, remained throughout the rest of the Civil War. Question 4. When and where did the American Civil War begin? Was it A, April the 15th, 1861 in Washington, D.C.? Or was it B, September the 17th, 1862 in Sharpsburg, Maryland? Or was it C, July the 1st, 1863 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? Or was it D, April the 12th, 1861 at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina? The answer is D. On April the 12th of 1861 at 4:30 a.m. in the morning, the American Civil War officially began when the Confederates opened fire with cannons on the United States Fort Sumter that was located on a small island in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And after almost 34 hours of continuous cannon fire, the United States surrendered Fort Sumter to the Confederates, and it was a Confederate victory that was commanded by the Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. And one of the most astonishing things about that battle is the fact that after many hours of continuous bombardment by the Confederates, not one single Union soldier was either wounded or killed. Question 5. How many states were in the United States when the Civil War started in April of 1861? Was it A, 13 states? Or was it B, 23 states? Or was it C, 34 states? Or was it D, 48 states? The answer is C, 34 states. At the beginning of the Civil War, the United States consisted of 34 states, and that included the 11 Southern Confederate states. By the end of the Civil War in 1865, the United States consisted of 36 states because West Virginia joined the United States in 1863 and Nevada joined the United States in 1864. Question 6. Including slaves and indentured servants, what was the population of the 34 states, including the 8 U.S. territories, when the Civil War began in April 1861? Was it A, 18 million? Or was it B, 23 million? Or was it C, 32 million? Or was it D, 38 million? The answer is C, 32 million people. And of those 32 million people, approximately 4 million were slaves and indentured servants. An indentured servant was a person who worked for somebody in order to pay off a debt to that same person who the indentured servant was working for, which made it a kind of a slavery itself. In addition to the 34 U.S. states, the 8 U.S. territories that were not states during the American Civil War was the territories of Washington, Dakota, Nevada, Utah, Nebraska, Colorado, New Mexico, and Indian Territory, which later became the state of Oklahoma. The population of the United States today is approximately 342 million people. Question 7. What was the color of the Confederate soldiers' uniform? Was it A, blue? Or was it B, gray? Or was it C, brown? Or was it D, light green? The answer is B, gray. The Confederate soldiers wore gray uniforms, and the Northern Union soldiers usually referred to the Southern Confederate soldiers as rebels or Johnny Rebs, and those Johnny Rebs were very well known for their very scary rebel yells during battle. And for many years after the Civil War was over, people would often ask one of the old rebel veterans if he could still do the rebel yell. And the old rebel veteran would always say, "Yes, I can, but in order to do it properly, I will first have to go for several weeks without eating any food, because a good rebel yell can only be done with a totally empty stomach." Question 8. What was the color of the Union soldiers' uniform? Was it A, blue? Was it B, dark tan? Was it C, brown? Or was it D, light green? The answer is A, blue. The United States soldier, also known as a Union soldier, wore a blue uniform, and the Confederate soldiers had nicknames for the Union soldiers too. They called them either Yankees, Yanks, Billy Yanks, or Blue Bellies. Question 9. What was the name of the most common food ration for the American Civil War soldier? Was it A, hardtack cracker? Or was it B, C ration? Or was it C, K ration? Or was it D, MRE, meal ready to eat? The answer is A, hardtack cracker. Hardtack was made from wheat flour mixed with salt and water, and then it was baked down to a hard cracker, and that's why it's called hardtack. And it was the standard food ration for soldiers who were on the march because it was easy to carry. The hardtack rations were mostly consumed by the Union soldiers because the Southern soldiers had what they called Johnny cakes for their food ration. And the Confederates' Johnny cake is very similar to the Union's hardtack, only instead of using wheat flour, salt, and water, the Confederates used cornmeal, salt, and water. The Confederate soldiers also ate what's called goober peas, and goober peas are boiled peanuts. And in fact, the Confederate soldiers even had a marching song that they called Peas, Peas, Eating Goober Peas. Civil War historians claim that the Confederate general, Stonewall Jackson, was very often seen eating a lemon, and that's why it has always been believed that that was the general's favorite fruit, a lemon. And that's why even to this very day, many Civil War buffs will very often leave a lemon laying on the general's grave in Lexington, Virginia. Question 10. Who were probably the two most popular generals who fought for the North, also known as the Union? Was it A, General J.E.B. Stuart and General A.P. Hill? Or was it B, General Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman? Or was it C, General George McClellan and General Winfield Scott? Or was it D, General Robert E. Lee and General Stonewall Jackson? The answer is B, General Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman. General Grant was well known to be a very effective military commander of the Union Army, and after the Civil War, General Grant went on to be our 18th President of the United States. General William Tecumseh Sherman was probably best known for his famous March to the Sea, when he took his Union Army and carved a 250-mile long by 50-mile wide swath from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way to Savannah, Georgia, where he arrived in Savannah in December of 1864. And on that march to the sea, General Sherman's soldiers, who were called Sherman's bummers, burned and destroyed everything that was in its path. And it's because of Sherman's bummers is why that term is still with us today. They're all a bunch of bums. General Sherman's soldiers affectionately referred to their commanding general as their Uncle Billy, and their Uncle Billy was a believer in what was called scorched earth warfare, because General Sherman believed that the worse you could make the war and demoralize the enemy, then the sooner the war would be over with. And there's another little known fact about General William Tecumseh Sherman. General Sherman did not like newspaper journalists, and in fact, he once said that you could kill every one of them and we would still be receiving rumors from hell before breakfast. Question 11. Who were probably the two most popular generals who fought for the South, also known as the Confederacy? Was it A, General Jeb Stuart and General A.P. Hill? Or was it B, General Braxton Bragg and General George Pickett? Or was it C, General George McClellan and General Winfield Scott? Or was it D, General Robert E. Lee and General Stonewall Jackson? The answer is D, General Robert E. Lee and General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Lieutenant Robert E. Lee graduated from West Point in 1829, and he graduated second in his class with no demerits. And at the beginning of the Civil War, General Robert E. Lee was already in his 50s, and he is probably best known for being the most brilliant military commander during the American Civil War, and that includes both North and South. And after the Civil War, General Robert E. Lee is well known for his hard work at trying to restore peace and reunite the United States. General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was very well known for being deeply religious, and he was well known for being absolutely fearless during a battle. And in fact, that's how he got his nickname, Stonewall. Question 12. Where was the first major Civil War land battle fought? Was it A, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? Or was it B, Manassas, Virginia? Or was it C, Antietam, Maryland? Or was it D, Pea Ridge, Arkansas? The answer is B, Manassas, Virginia. 3 months after the Civil War officially began at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, the Union Army and the Confederate Army met for the first time on a battlefield located near Manassas, Virginia, on July the 21st of 1861. The Johnny Reb Confederates, in their gray uniforms, numbered about 29,000 soldiers, and the Union Army, in their blue uniforms, numbered about 35,000 soldiers. The Confederates called it the Battle of Manassas, but the Union called it the Battle of Bull Run. The battlefield was located only about 30 miles from Washington, D.C., so there were many citizens and politicians who came out to watch the battle, and some even brought their blankets and picnic baskets, because at the time, many people believed that the Civil War would only last just a few minutes, and one politician even said that there would be such little bloodshed that he would be able to clean it all up with his handkerchief. But when the battle began and the citizens started witnessing the horrible carnage, then total chaos ensued. And the citizens and politicians all started running and screaming for their lives all the way back to Washington, D.C. By the end of the battle, there was a total of 868 soldiers who were killed, and there was a total of 2,593 soldiers who were seriously wounded. So not counting those who were missing in action or who had deserted, there was 3,461 total casualties. The Johnny Rebs had routed the Union Army, and the battle was a total Confederate victory. Oh, and by the way, it was during the heat of that battle when the Confederate General, Thomas Jackson, earned his famous nickname when one of the other Confederate officers made a statement. "Look, there stands General Jackson over there like a stone wall." And forevermore after that, he was always known as General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Question 13. What was the name of General Robert E. Lee's horse? Was it A, Cincinnati? Or was it B, Duke? Or was it C, Traveler? Or was it D, Little Sorrel? The answer is C, Traveler. Back in the 1800s, a horse was the main mode of transportation, and Civil War historians claimed that General Robert E. Lee and his horse Traveler were practically inseparable. And in fact, today, General Robert E. Lee is buried in Lexington, Virginia, and his horse Traveler is buried close to him. Cincinnati was General Grant's horse, and Duke was General Sherman's horse, and Little Sorrel was General Jackson's horse. The name of the horse that belonged to the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, was Blackjack. When Abraham Lincoln moved to Washington, D.C. in February of 1861, he left his horse, Old Bob, back in Springfield, Illinois. But 4 years later, in 1865, Lincoln's horse, Old Bob, did have a special place of honor in Lincoln's funeral procession. Back during the Civil War, a teamer or a teamster was a person who was skilled at driving a team of horses or mules, pulling a wagon, and the mule skinner was a person who was skilled at training mules for pulling a wagon. And a farrier was a person who was skilled at cleaning, trimming, and taking care of the hooves of horses and mules. And for you folks out there who do not know what a mule is, that's the offspring from a male donkey and a female horse. And the male mule is called a Johnny, and the female mule is called a Molly. Mules are stronger, more sure-footed, and they require less feed and less water than a horse. And that's why a mule is the animal of choice for packing or pulling heavy loads over a long distance. There are some Civil War historians who estimate that there could have been somewhere over 1 million horses and mules that were used during the American Civil War. Question 14. What were the names of the two ironclad warships that fought on March the 8th and 9th of 1862 near Hampton Roads, Virginia? Was it A, the Union ship USS Monitor and the Confederate ship CSS Virginia? Or was it B, the Union ship USS Cairo and the Confederate ship CSS Raleigh? Or was it C, the Union's USS Alligator and the Confederates CSS Arkansas? Or was it D, the Confederates CSS Hunley and the Union ship USS Housatonic? The answer is A, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. Early in the Civil War, the Confederates had captured the United States USS Merrimack. And after they installed iron plating and turned it into an ironclad ship, the Confederates then renamed the USS Merrimack to the CSS Virginia. And when the Virginia and the Monitor met, they fired at each other with heavy cannon fire for many hours and at very close range, but neither ship was able to penetrate the other's armored plating, so they finally just called it quits. And even though it was a stalemate, both sides went on to claim a victory. In the water, the majority of the USS Monitor was well below the waterline, so about the only thing exposed was the large round gun turret that was located at midship and on top of the deck. And when President Abraham Lincoln first saw the USS Monitor, he said the ship looked like a large cheese box that was sitting on top of a raft. Later on during the Civil War, the Confederates built a small submarine that they called the CSS H.L. Hunley. And the small Confederate submarine, the Hunley, used an 8-man crew who would manually turn a propeller shaft by using a series of pedals and cranks for forward propulsion. And on February the 17th of 1864, the CSS Hunley successfully attacked and sank the United States USS Housatonic in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And it became the first submarine in history to successfully attack and sink an enemy ship, which changed naval warfare forever. Question 15. Which battle was the bloodiest single-day battle of the Civil War and was fought on September the 17th, 1862? Was it A, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? Or was it B, Antietam, Maryland? Or was it C, Chickamauga, Georgia? Or was it D, Shiloh, Tennessee? The answer is B, Antietam, Maryland. Also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, Maryland by the Confederates, that one single-day battle within a 24-hour period produced 23,000 casualties, and included in that number approximately 3,600 soldiers were killed. And during that one-day battle, there were 3 Confederate generals and there were 3 Union generals who were killed. At the end of the one-day battle, and after 23,000 casualties, the battle was a Union victory. The casualty count and the carnage of the battle was horrendous. And since there was a very short supply of chloroform and ether that was used for an anesthetic, the surgeon would give the wounded soldier a lead bullet to bite down on, as the soldier would be fully awake while the surgeon performed an amputation by using a handsaw. And that old saying is still with us today. You're just going to have to bite the bullet. And even after all these many years, doctors still carry that same nickname, Dr. Sawbones. A self-taught nurse named Clara Barton came to Antietam, and she assisted the doctors and the surgeons, and she attended to the wounded and the dying. And Clara Barton also attended many other battles during the Civil War. And 16 years after the Civil War was over, Clara Barton went on and founded the American Red Cross in 1881. Question 16. Which battle was the biggest battle of the Civil War and was fought on July the 1st through the 3rd, 1863? Was it A, Chickamauga, Georgia? Or was it B, Chancellorsville, Virginia? Or was it C, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? Or was it D, Shiloh, Tennessee? The answer is C, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There were approximately 165,000 soldiers who fought the 3-day battle that produced approximately 51,000 casualties. And from that number of casualties, approximately 7,000 soldiers were killed. At the end of the battle, it was a Union victory, and the Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, had lost approximately 1/3 of his entire army, and the Confederates had to retreat back to Virginia, and that ended the Confederates' invasion into the northern states. Many historians refer to the Battle of Gettysburg as the granddaddy of all Civil War battles, and the turning point of the Civil War that would ultimately result in a Union victory. 4 months after the battle was over, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and on November the 19th of 1863, he delivered his famous Gettysburg Address speech, which would later be recognized as probably the most famous speech in all of American history. Question 17. Which battle was the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War and was fought on September the 18th through the 20th, 1863? Was it A, Chickamauga, Georgia? Or was it B, Chancellorsville, Virginia? Or was it C, Fredericksburg, Virginia? Or was it D, Parker's Crossroads, Tennessee? The answer is A, Chickamauga, Georgia. The three-day battle at Chickamauga, Georgia was the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and it took place only 2.5 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There were 120,000 Union and Confederate soldiers who met at the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia. And at the end of the three-day battle, there was approximately 35,000 total casualties. And out of that number, there was approximately 4,000 soldiers who were killed. The Union commander was General William Rosecrans, whose nickname was Old Rosie. And the Confederate commander was General Braxton Bragg. The Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia was a Confederate victory. Question 18. Which American Civil War battle was best known as the Battle Above the Clouds? Was it A, the Battle of Ivy Mountain, Kentucky? Or was it B, the Battle of Cedar Mountain, Virginia? Or was it C, the Battle of Lookout Mountain, Tennessee? Or was it D, the Battle of Droop Mountain, West Virginia? The answer is C, the Battle of Lookout Mountain, Tennessee. And the battle was fought on November the 24th, 1863. Lookout Mountain is approximately 1,200 feet higher and overlooking Chattanooga, Tennessee, and the Tennessee River. On the morning of the battle, there was a heavy fog surrounding the base of the mountain, and that's why it's always been called the Battle Above the Clouds. There were approximately 1,900 total casualties, those who were seriously wounded, and there was approximately 100 soldiers who were killed. The Confederates were commanded by General Carter Stevenson, and the Union soldiers were commanded by General Joseph Hooker, and the battle was a Union victory. The Union General Joseph Hooker had a reputation for partying hard and for being a hard drinker. And General Hooker was also very well known for bringing in wagon loads of women to entertain his soldiers because he believed that it was good for his soldiers' morale. And those many wagon loads of women were called General Hooker's girls. And as the many years passed by, those kind of women became known to be just hookers. And yes, that name is still with us today. She's a hooker. And so now I will leave it all up to you school teachers out there to explain that one to your class. Question 19. Which Civil War Navy officer shouted these famous words, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead"? Was it A, Admiral Franklin Buchanan? Or was it B, Rear Admiral David Farragut? Or was it C, Captain Percival Drayton? Or was it D, Lieutenant Commander James Jowett? The answer is B, Rear Admiral David Farragut. On August the 5th of 1864, the Union Navy under the command of Rear Admiral David Farragut, sailed into Mobile Bay, Alabama, to attack the Confederates' Fort Gaines and the Confederates' Fort Morgan. And on that day, Farragut was in command of 16 Union naval ships. 12 were wooden ships, and 4 ships were ironclads. And Rear Admiral David Farragut's flagship was the USS Hartford. The Confederates had put underwater mines in Mobile Bay. And back during the American Civil War, underwater mines were called torpedoes. Today we think of a torpedo as an underwater missile that's fired from a submarine at an enemy surface ship. But back during the Civil War, the stationary underwater mines were called torpedoes. And when Farragut saw one of his ironclad ships, the Tecumseh, explode when it hit a Confederate underwater mine, that's when he said these famous words to 2 of his officers. "Damn the torpedoes. 4 bells, Captain Drayton. Go ahead, Jowett, full speed." In Navy jargon, 4 bells means to proceed forward as fast as possible. Over the many years, what Rear Admiral David Farragut actually said has been simplified to just "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Within just a few days, the Confederates surrendered Fort Gaines and they surrendered Fort Morgan, and the battle was a Union victory. 2 years after that battle, and in July of 1866, Rear Admiral David Glasgow Farragut was promoted, and he became the very first full admiral in the United States Navy. And at the end of his career, he had served our country for 59 years in uniform. Question 20. Who were the 2 best well-known photographers during the American Civil War in the 1860s? Was it A, George Eastman and Ansel Adams? Or was it B, Walter Evans and Arthur Rothstein? Or was it C, George Bernard and Timothy O'Sullivan? Or was it D, Mathew Brady and Alexander Gardner? The answer is D, Mathew Brady and Alexander Gardner. There were many Civil War photographers, but Mathew Brady and Alexander Gardner were the 2 best known Civil War photographers. There were many thousands of photographs that were taken during the Civil War, but the most popular were the portrait photographs that were taken of the individual soldiers, and those photographs were called tintypes. And a tintype was an inexpensive type of photograph, whereas the image was put onto a thin sheet of metal. Civil War photographers usually did not get to the battlefields until several days after the battle was over. And the photographers always said that they could smell the stench in the air from up to 5 miles away before arriving at the battlefield, where hundreds of dead soldiers, dead horses, and dead mules still laid on the ground where they had fallen. After the battles were over, the armies would move on, and they would leave behind many dead soldiers and dead animals. But the one thing that the armies never left behind were the perfectly good rifles. So the rifle that you see laying next to a dead Civil War soldier in one of those old photographs belonged to the photographer, and they were called photographer's property. And after all these many years, that term is still with us today. Only now it's just simply called a photo prop. Question 21. Where and when did the American Civil War officially end? Was it A, Washington, D.C. on April the 15th, 1865? Or was it B, Richmond, Virginia on April the 14th, 1865? Or was it C, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April the 9th, 1865? Or was it D, Charleston, South Carolina, on April the 12th, 1865? The answer is C, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April the 9th, 1865. The Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant, and that officially ended the very bloody 4-year American Civil War between the states. And then on orders from General Grant, the Union Army shared their food rations with the starving Confederate Army, who had no food and who had not eaten in several days. 1 month later, on May the 10th of 1865, the Union Army captured the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, at Irwinville, Georgia. And then 2 days later after that, on May the 12th and the 13th, and even though the war was officially over, the very last Civil War battle took place at Palmetto Ranch, Texas, between the Confederates and the Union Army. And it was a Confederate victory. And even though it was the Confederates who won both the first and the last battles, it was still the Union who won the Civil War. And then after all of that, and everything was over with everywhere, then Reconstruction began. And all 36 states started coming back together again as one nation, the United States of America. Question 22. Which of the following was used during the Civil War? Was it A, repeating rifles and machine guns? Or was it B, aircraft and rockets? Or was it C, railroads and telegraphs? Or was it D, all of the above? Or was it E, none of the above? The answer is D, all of the above. Most Civil War soldiers, both North and South, carried the muzzle-loading type of rifle, but many of the Union soldiers carried what was called the Henry rifle. Early in the 1860s, a gun designer named Benjamin Tyler Henry designed and built the very first reliable lever-action repeating rifle that was manufactured by the New Haven Arms Company. The Henry, as it was known, was a .44 caliber, breech-loading, lever-action, rim-fire repeating rifle that held 16 rounds of ammunition. And sometimes the Confederate soldiers would complain that those Yankees can load their rifles on Sunday and shoot all week. In the 1860s, having a Henry repeating rifle was a big deal, and even Abraham Lincoln himself owned a Henry rifle. The Gatling gun was a machine type of gun that used a manual hand crank that rotated 6 .45 caliber barrels around in a circle, and the Gatling gun's rate of fire was anywhere from 250 to 350 rounds per minute, depending on how fast the operator would turn the hand crank. And both sides, the Union and the Confederates, each had and used a few manually operated Gatling machine guns. When most people hear the word aircraft, they usually think of an airplane, but a hydrogen-filled balloon is also an aircraft. They weren't used very often, but there were a few hydrogen-filled balloons that were used for reconnaissance by both the Union and the Confederates. And both sides also used a few Hale rockets, H-A-L-E, rockets that were designed by a British rocket designer named William Hale. The 7-inch diameter solid fuel Hale rocket weighed about 60 pounds, and it had a range of about 6,000 feet, which is just a little over 1 mile. The Hale rockets were used on some occasions by both the Union and the Confederates, but they weren't used very often. And railroads and steam locomotives were used quite a bit by both the Union and the Confederates for moving soldiers, moving equipment, and moving supplies. During the American Civil War, there were many miles of telegraph wire that was used extensively by both the North and the South. And in fact, President Abraham Lincoln spent a great deal of his time at the telegraph station waiting to hear from his generals. And then one day in April 1865, when President Lincoln received the word that General Lee had surrendered the Confederate Army to General Grant, President Lincoln became so excited that he ordered the band to play the Confederate song, Dixieland. And President Lincoln once said that that song, Dixieland, was one of his favorite tunes. Question 23. What was the name of the most notorious Civil War camp during the American Civil War? Was it A, Camp Morton, Indianapolis, Indiana? Or was it B, Florence Stockade, Florence, South Carolina? Or was it C, Camp Douglas, Chicago, Illinois? Or was it D, Camp Sumter at Andersonville, Georgia? The answer is D, Andersonville, Georgia. The Confederates referred to the prison as Camp Sumter because it was located in Sumter County, Georgia, but not to be confused with Fort Sumter in South Carolina, where the Civil War began. The 45,000 Union soldiers who were held there as prisoners of war referred to it as just Andersonville because it was located near a small town called Andersonville, Georgia. There were several other notorious prisoner of war camps, but Andersonville, Georgia was the most notorious POW camp because in just the 14 months that it was in operation, from the end of February of 1864 to the middle of April of 1865, there was 13,000 Union prisoners who died there from starvation, diseases, malnutrition, and exposure. The prison consisted of 26.5 acres of land that was surrounded by a 15-foot high stockade fence, and the 45,000 Union soldiers inside just had to live on the ground with no shelter and very little food and no medical attention whatsoever. And it was truly hell on earth. The prison's camp commander was a Confederate officer, Captain Henry Wirz, W-I-R-Z. And after the Civil War was over, Captain Wirz became the only soldier who was ever hanged for war crimes. And later on, it was discovered that one of the persons who had testified against Captain Wirz had never even been to Andersonville. And those kind of testimonies at a trial usually only happen at a kangaroo court. Question 24. How many soldiers died during the 4-year Civil War? Was it A, 350,000 total deaths? Or was it B, 450,000 total deaths? Or was it C, 550,000 total deaths? Or was it D, 650,000 total deaths? The answer is D, 650,000 total deaths. But nobody really knows the actual number because of a lack of good record keeping during the American Civil War. So that 650,000 number is just a good guesstimate by Civil War historians. And the Civil War historians also claim that about one half of those soldiers who died did not die from bullets on the battlefield, because those soldiers actually died from many different kinds of diseases and malnutrition. Historians also claim there was probably at least another 650,000 soldiers who were seriously wounded, but went on and lived and survived the Civil War. So when you add it all together, that brings the total casualty count to a total of somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million soldiers who had either died or who had been seriously wounded during the American Civil War. And that number does not include the many thousands of horses and mules that were killed during the many Civil War battles. The state that suffered the largest number of deaths was the state of New York, with 39,000 soldiers who had died. And the state that suffered the most property damage was the state of Virginia. Question 25. When and where did President Abraham Lincoln die? Was it A, April the 9th, 1865, at the White House in Washington, D.C.? Or was it B, April the 14th, 1865, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C.? Or was it C, April the 15th, 1865, at the Peterson House in Washington, D.C.? Or was it D, April the 12th, 1865, at the Capitol Building in Washington, D.C.? The answer is C, April the 15th, 1865, at the Peterson House in Washington, D.C. 5 days after the Civil War had officially ended, and on April the 14th of 1865, President Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, got into their Studebaker horse-drawn carriage and went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to attend a play that was called My American Cousin. And it was during that play when an actor who worked at that theater named John Wilkes Booth shot President Lincoln in the head with a .44 caliber Derringer pistol. President Lincoln did not die immediately, but he was totally unconscious. And a doctor and several others moved President Lincoln from the Ford's Theater across the street to a boarding house called the Peterson House, where he could better be attended to by medical people. But the next morning, on April the 15th, and at 7:22 a.m., President Abraham Lincoln took his last breath and died. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was with President Lincoln when he passed away, said these immortal words, "Now he belongs to the ages." And thank you so much for taking my 25-question American Civil War quiz test. I hope you passed it. I hope you learned something. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did like it, then please click on that thumbs up button and or send me a comment. Thank you again, and goodbye.